Good evening, my friend. I'm glad you're here, safe, in a warm and quiet place where the flicker of a candle keeps the night gentle. Tonight, I will tell you a story, one so old that only a few remember it now. But those who do remember every word. This is the story of the night the plague came to my door. Don't be afraid. I will tell it gently so you can drift away while we walk together through the empty streets of an ancient city. Come with me. Let the sound of my voice carry you into another time, another life.
I remember that night, as if it were painted into my memory, with the softest strokes of shadow and firelight. The city had fallen silent hours ago. The market stalls, once alive with shouts and laughter, were nothing more than empty frames swaying in the cold wind. A damp mist clung to the cobblestones, curling around my boots, each step echoing too loudly in the hollow streets. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something heavier, the scent people whispered about, the scent of sickness. Some said you could feel it before it reached your street, that it crept in under doors and rested in the walls before anyone dared to speak its name. Somewhere in the distance, a slow bell tolled. 1 strike, 2, 3. Each chime fading into the mist, leaving behind a deeper silence. It was then that I saw it, a shadow at the far end of the street, tall, deliberate, moving with a strange, solemn grace. The long beak of the mask caught the lantern glow, and for a moment it was as though a great black bird had taken human form and stepped into my world.
I stopped walking, not because I wanted to, but because my body refused another step. The figure moved slowly, each stride measured, certain, the coat swaying gently with the rhythm of his steps. The beaked mask turned slightly, as though it sensed me, even in the heavy darkness. But it did not quicken, nor slow. It continued, each step falling into the hollow rhythm of the distant bell. I pressed my back to the wall of a shuttered bakery. The wood was cold. Above, a shutter hook clinked in the wind, and for a moment I almost convinced myself this was just a weary man returning home. But then The lantern dipped and caught the pale curve of his mask again, and I knew I was looking at the face of the plague itself, or at least the face it had chosen to wear that night.
From here, the city opened in my mind like a memory. I could see it as it had been just weeks before the sickness arrived. The morning market bursting with color, barrels of apples shining red and green, woven baskets filled with herbs, merchants calling out their prices, the sound of hammers from the blacksmith's yard, children's laughter chasing through the alleys, the clatter of wagon wheels on stone. By midday, the streets would swell until one could barely move for the press of bodies. The smell of baking bread drifted from the bakeries, mingling with the salt air carried in from the harbor. And yet, that world had slipped away so quickly. Now, even at midday, the market stood nearly empty. Those who came kept their distance, eyes darting toward any cough, any stumble. Coins exchanged hands wrapped in scraps of cloth. Merchants wore sprigs of rosemary pinned to their tunics. Some tied strips of cloth soaked in vinegar across their mouths and noses. The city was already holding its breath.
At night, it was worse. No laughter, no footsteps save for your own. The taverns, once loud with song and argument, now silent as tombs. Only the faint creak of wood and the occasional cry of a stray cat echoed through the streets. The lamps burned dimmer now. Some say it was to save oil. Others whispered it was because the light drew the attention of wandering spirits, restless in these plague-ridden nights. And always, always, the slow bell from the church tower. It marked not the hour, but the passing of another soul. Each strike rolling over the rooftops, until it seemed the city itself was tolling its own fate. That night, the mist was thicker than I had seen in months. It clung to the ground in curling tendrils, sliding over my boots, curling around doorsteps. The world beyond the nearest lantern faded into a shifting gray void. The figure ahead moved within it, part shadow, part man. The long coat swayed with each step, the wide-brimmed hat casting his mask into deeper shadow, and always that beak, curved and unblinking. I could smell the faint trace of herbs even from here, rosemary, thyme, and something sharper, almost bitter. The scent carried strange comfort, even as my skin prickled with unease. He passed a narrow lane and paused. The lantern at his side swayed gently, sending ripples of gold across the mist. The pause was brief, yet heavy. Then he moved on, his boots striking the stones in measured rhythm. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But as I did, I heard it. Another set of footsteps, closer, quicker, not running, not yet, but closing the gap. The hair at the back of my neck rose. I began walking again, faster now. The sound behind me matched my pace, always just a few beats behind. I did not look back. The streets had narrowed here, the houses leaning in on either side, their upper stories nearly touching. Shadows clung to the walls like damp cloth. A shutter banged somewhere overhead. The footsteps quickened. So did mine. The street opened into a small square, empty but for the dry fountain in its center. I crossed without slowing, my eyes fixed on the far side. The footsteps behind me slowed again, matching mine once more. It was like being followed by an echo that refused to fade. I turned down my own street, home. 2 floors of pale stone, the shutters closed, a faint curl of smoke from the chimney. No other houses on the street showed smoke anymore. I climbed the worn steps to my door, rested my palm against the wood. It was cool, familiar. Yet tonight it felt like the only barrier between myself and the hollow, silent city. I stood there for a moment longer, my hand resting against the wood of the door. It felt as though the grain of it pressed back against my palm, grounding me. This door had kept out many winters. It had kept out storms and drunken strangers wandering home from the tavern. But tonight it felt frail, a thin skin between me and whatever waited in the dark. Behind me, silence. Yet silence is rarely truly empty. The air held weight, like the pause between a question and its answer. I turned the key. The lock gave with a soft metallic sigh. I slipped inside, closing the door behind me with care. The wood settled into its frame, the sound almost like a sigh of relief. Inside, the air was warmer, but still carried the faint scent of smoke from the street. I set the bar across the door. The heavy beam fell into place with a quiet, reassuring thud. I leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed, letting the stillness wrap itself around me. The house was just as I had left it. The table near the hearth, chairs tucked neatly in, a basket of apples rested by the fire, their skins catching the faint glow. On the shelves, jars of herbs sat in patient rows, thyme, sage, lavender. The familiar smell of them was soothing, but also brought a pang of unease. Herbs were no longer just for cooking. They were shields now, charms against the invisible tide that washed through the streets. I moved to the hearth and stirred the embers.
They glowed faintly, like the eyes of some small creature in the dark. I added a log, watched the flames catch, licking their way up the bark. The soft crackle filled the room, a gentle anchor against the vast, hollow quiet outside.
I took my seat in the old wooden chair beside the fire. Its frame creaked under my weight, familiar in every sound. Here in this chair, I had read countless letters, mended gloves, watched rain bead and race down the windows. But tonight, I listened. The quiet beyond the shutters was deep, but every now and then, a sound brushed against it. A creak, a faint shifting. The kind of noises you tell yourself belong to the settling of wood or the wind twisting through narrow streets. I wanted to believe that. I nearly did.
Then the first knock came. It was not loud. In fact, it was softer than I expected. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the wood, each one spaced far apart, as though whoever stood there had all the time in the world. I froze. My hand hovered halfway to the armrest. Through the wood I could hear the faintest rustle, leather shifting, the small adjustment of weight from one boot to another. The second knock came, slightly louder, yet still measured. I rose slowly from my chair. Each board beneath my feet creaked in protest, carrying my steps forward. I stopped just short of the door, my ear tilting toward it. That was when I smelled it. The sharp, dry scent of herbs drifting under the threshold. Rosemary, juniper, a hint of clove. They masked the air, just as they masked the fear that clung to the city. I did not open the door. I did not speak. The silence stretched between us, the one inside and the one outside. I imagined him standing there, tall in his dark coat, the wide brim of his hat shading the mask's round glass eyes, the beak dipping slightly as he listened for any sound within. Minutes passed, or perhaps they were seconds. Time bends in such moments. Then the sound of metal. A clasp being unfastened, a latch. It was followed by the faint scrape of leather against stone. Not retreating, just shifting. He was moving, but still close. In my mind, the image sharpened. The lantern in his gloved hand swayed gently, its light rippling across the wall beside my door. The beak of the mask caught the glow, and for a moment I could almost believe those dark glass lenses were eyes peering straight into my own. I stepped back from the door. 1 step, 2, 3. The scent of herbs grew stronger. It seemed to seep into the air itself, curling into every corner of the room. It was not unpleasant, almost calming, and that unsettled me more than anything. Then, silence again. The kind of silence that pulls at the edges of your thoughts. I strained to hear any movement, but the air held still. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, its crackle fading into a low murmur. At last, the sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate, moving away from the door. 1, 2, 3. Fading into the distance, swallowed by the mist beyond the shutters.
I stood there for a long while, long enough that the warmth from the hearth no longer reached me. Then, slowly, I lifted the bar from the door. It felt heavier than it had before. I opened the door just a fraction. The hinges groaned softly in the stillness. The street lay empty. The mist clung low to the stones, curling like smoke. The far end of the road was lost to shadow. But there, on the top step, a small folded scrap of parchment. I bent to pick it up. The paper was cold, slightly damp from the mist. I unfolded it with careful fingers. Inside, in a hand as precise as a surgeon's cut, were 3 words. Prepare the house. I stood in the open doorway for a long moment, the slip of paper still in my hand. Mist curled in around my legs, cool and damp, carrying with it the smell of wet stone and faint chimney smoke. The street lay empty, silent in the way only a sleeping city can be. I looked again at the words, "Prepare the house," written in a hand so steady, so deliberate, it felt less like a message and more like a verdict. I closed the door, slowly, carefully. The latch caught with a small click that seemed too loud in the hush of the night. I slid the bar back into place. It thudded into its sockets with a weight I felt in my chest. I set the paper on the table beside the door. For a moment, I simply stood there, staring at it. It seemed to draw the candlelight toward itself, the folded edges casting long, delicate shadows across the wood.
My mind reached for meanings. Prepare the house. Was it a warning, a request, or merely the announcement of an inevitability? I thought of what I had heard in the market only days before. A neighbor's sister, pale, shaking, coughing until she could barely speak. Her family had shuttered their home and hung a sprig of rosemary above the door. 2 days later, the rosemary was gone, and no one saw the family again. I moved away from the door, deeper into the house. The fire still glowed faintly in the hearth, casting long amber shadows across the room. The smell of herbs hung in the air, thyme, lavender, sage, though now it seemed thinner, as though the mist outside had begun to dilute it. The first task was simple: check the shutters. I moved from room to room, pressing each one closed, setting the wooden stays firmly in place. The old hinges creaked under my touch. In the small bedroom upstairs, I pushed the shutters tight and tied the inner latch. The wind rattled them once in protest, then fell still.
Next, the herbs. On the kitchen shelf, drawers stood neatly in rows, labeled in my own hand. I took down bundles of rosemary and thyme, hanging fresh sprigs above the doors and windows. The scent sharpened instantly, earthy, resinous, with the faint sweetness of sun-dried leaves. It mingled with the smell of the fire until the two became inseparable. I filled small cloth pouches with dried lavender and sage, setting them along the windowsills. Their soft weight felt reassuring in my hands, though I knew herbs alone could not stop what stalked the streets. From the cupboard, I drew a small bowl and filled it with vinegar. I dipped strips of cloth into it, the sharp tang stinging my nose and eyes. I laid them near the hearth to dry slightly. They would be tied across the mouth and nose should the air grow heavy with sickness. I could hear the echo of old advice. The plague rides on the breath, on the dampness of the night air, on the nearness of strangers. And though I did not know if it was truth or superstition, tonight I would believe anything that offered even the shadow of safety.
Hours seemed to pass this way. The rhythm of preparation steadied me. Shutter, latch, herb, cloth. Each action a small wall against the vast, invisible tide beyond the door. Finally, I returned to the main room. The fire had burned lower, but still gave enough light to soften the corners of the room. The paper lay where I had left it, the ink dark against its pale surface. Prepare the house. I had done what I could. The rest was beyond me. I took my seat by the fire. The chair embraced me with its familiar creak. I pulled the blanket over my knees. My body longed for rest, but my ears strained for every sound beyond the walls. The city was not silent now, not entirely. Somewhere, faintly, a dog barked, its voice sharp in the distance before it fell quiet. Closer, the wind sighed between the narrow houses, rattling a loose shutter hook.
Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, dragging, but they faded each time I held my breath to listen. And then the bell. Far away, deep and mournful. One strike. 2. 3.
The sound rolled over the rooftops and along the empty streets, settling into the marrow of the night. The bell did not ring for the hour. It rang for the departed. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe slowly. The blanket grew warmer. The fire whispered softly in the grate. And yet, beneath it all, a presence pressed against my awareness.
It began as a weight in the air, then a faint rhythm, too slow for a run, too deliberate for a wanderer. Footsteps, measured, certain, drawing nearer. I opened my eyes. The firelight blurred for a moment before it sharpened again. The rhythm continued, soft against the stone, but growing. 1, 2, 1, 2. The sound entered my street. It did not hurry. It did not pause. It came straight for my door.
The footsteps stopped right outside my door. Silence bloomed in their absence, heavy, absolute, and yet full of presence. I could hear the faintest shift of weight, leather boots creaking, the subtle sigh of fabric settling. He was there, close enough to touch the door if he wished. Perhaps he already was. Then 3 knocks, slow, measured, each one spaced far apart, as though he were testing the stillness between them. I sat motionless in my chair by the fire. The blanket felt suddenly heavier across my knees. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed too loud, as if it might carry through the wood and betray me.
The scent reached me next. Dry, resinous rosemary, bitter juniper, and beneath it, something faintly metallic, like the whisper of iron. It clung to the air, curling into the folds of the blanket, threading its way into my lungs. Another knock. Gentle this time, almost polite. The kind of knock you give when you know the door will open. I imagined the figure standing there, tall and unmoving, the lantern in his hand spilling its light in a trembling circle across the stones, the mask's dark lenses catching the glow, reflecting nothing back.
I wanted to speak, to say, "Who's there?" But the words refused to form. They seemed useless, because I already knew the answer. A sound, the faint chime of metal, a clasp unfastening, a latch drawn open. It was followed by the quiet scuff of leather shifting on stone. I pictured the long beak of the mask tilting toward the door, the glass eyes narrowing in their empty way, listening for breath, for the creak of a floorboard, for me. The knocks stopped, but he did not leave. The silence grew long and longer still, until it became its own sound, pressing in on the walls. I could hear the faint hiss of the fire in the hearth, the gentle click of the clock on the mantel, and beneath it all, the absence of retreating footsteps. He was still there.
My mind began to measure the air, the warmth from the fire, the chill that seemed to creep in from the door, the way the shadows pooled thicker near the threshold. Another knock, this one softer, but closer somehow, as though his head were nearer the wood, or the sound came from just at my ear. I shut my eyes. The scent of herbs seemed stronger now, too strong. It filled my nose, my throat, the space behind my eyes. The room itself seemed to breathe it. Then movement, not away, but up, a slow, deliberate step to the side, the faint groan of a floorboard outside the door.
For a long while, there was only this, the slow pacing from one side of the door to the other, a pause at each window, the weight of a presence felt but unseen, and then silence again. I counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. The count faltered when I realized there was a faint shape at the edge of the curtain. I rose slowly, silently. The floor complained underfoot. I moved to the window nearest the door. The curtain hung still, but beyond it, pressed almost flat to the shutter, was the suggestion of a shadow.
The brim of a wide hat, the curve of a long beak. He was listening, leaning toward the gap, perhaps smelling the air that seeped out, testing it. I stepped back into the deeper shadows of the room. The blanket slipped from my knees, pooling soundlessly on the floor.
And then a sound like a sigh, the faint rasp of fabric moving against wood. A step back, footsteps, measured again, deliberate again, moving away. 1, 2, 3. Fading into the mist, but the scent remained, thick and unshaken, clinging to the air in the room long after he was gone. It felt as if the walls themselves had absorbed it and would release it back to me each time I breathed. I lowered myself back into the chair. The fire's light was dimmer now, its warmth thinner. I stared at the door. The paper on the table beside it still read the same 3 words. Prepare the house. I wondered if this had been the preparation he meant all along.
The fire had burned low. Its light trembled in the grate, shadows leaning long across the floor. The air in the room felt thicker now, heavier, as though it carried the weight of his visit. The scent lingered still. Rosemary, juniper, woven through the smell of smoke and old wood. It curled around my senses like a slow tide. I sat there, unmoving. The chair creaked softly as it settled under my weight. My hands lay in my lap, still, as though they too feared to break the silence. Beyond the door, nothing. No footsteps, no bell, only the low hiss of the fire and the faint, almost imagined rustle of the mist against the shutters. I glanced toward the small table by the door. The paper lay there, its folds catching the dim light. Prepare the house. The words seemed different now, less a command, more a statement of what had already begun.
I rose slowly, my legs stiff from sitting. The blanket slid to the floor with a soft sigh of wool. I walked the rooms again, touching the shutters, the latches, the herbs hanging above each door. My fingers brushed the rough wood, the smooth glass jars, the cool metal hooks. Everything was as I had left it, yet everything felt changed. In the kitchen, I poured a small cup of water from the earthen jug. The clay felt cool in my palm. The water's surface quivered faintly in the candlelight. I drank slowly, letting each swallow wash away the dryness in my throat. I returned to the main room. The fire had slumped into a red glow, small tongues of flame licking at the last of the wood. I added another log, watching the embers swallow it with quiet patience. The warmth crept back slowly, filling the space between myself
and the shadows. I pulled the chair closer to the hearth. Outside, the mist thickened. I could see it pressing against the edges of the shutters, blurring the faintest slivers of night. It moved like a living thing, curling, shifting, breathing. I leaned back in the chair. The blanket was warm again around my legs. My eyes grew heavy, though my thoughts drifted like the mist beyond the walls. I thought of the city, the streets I had walked only that morning, the market stalls with their cautious merchants, the empty spaces where laughter used to be, the doors closed tight against the night. And somewhere out there, he walked still, lantern swaying, coat whispering, the beak of his mask cutting through the mist.
I imagined him turning a corner, stopping at another door, knocking with that same patient rhythm, perhaps leaving another folded note, perhaps stepping away into the fog without a word. How many doors tonight? How many houses whispered the same warning inside their walls? The thought should have chilled me. Instead, it wrapped around me like the blanket, heavy, inevitable, strangely comforting. The fire's crackle softened into a slow whisper. The room was warm now, the air thick with the scent of herbs and smoke. My eyelids drooped. The candle on the table burned low, the wax pooling at its base. Somewhere in the distance, a single bell tolled, one strike. It lingered in the air, then faded into the dark.
I let my eyes close. The weight of the night settled over me, not as fear, but as a deep, pulling tide, the kind that draws you down into sleep, where the world softens and the sharp edges of thought blur away. I heard the wind sigh against the shutters one last time. The fire exhaled a small pop of ember, and then silence. The kind of silence that belongs only to the deepest hour of night. And as I drifted into sleep, the last image that lingered was not of the fire, or the paper, or the shuttered windows. It was of him, walking the streets through the mist, lantern swaying, coat whispering, never rushing, never stopping, until he reached the next door, and somewhere, in the stillness of my dream, he knocked.